The trouble started with a noise like a cat being strangled by a blender, only much louder and a lot less pleasant. Which, if you're sitting on a teleportation hub in the middle of the galaxy, is never a good sound. Vortex Relay 7 wasn't exactly known for its decorum, but exploding wasn't on the menu today, at least, not according to the lunchtime announcements. Commander Thalra Garin, who had the distinct pleasure of being in charge of this tin can, was jolted awake from a nap at her console. She wiped drool off her chin with the sleeve of her uniform and squinted at the flashing red lights doing their best impression of a malfunctioning disco ball. Great. There goes my coffee break. The comms crackled to life. Commander, you seeing this? It was Rick, her trusty, if ridiculously pessimistic navigator. The guy had all the optimism of a depressed goldfish. If by this you mean the station shaking itself to bits, then yeah, I'm seeing it. Thalra tapped a few buttons, hoping to sweet-talk the control panel into something useful. Status. Well, the good news is we're not dead yet. The bad news is I think the station wants to kill us. Rick's voice was a comforting contrast to the chaos outside, dripping with sarcasm and just the right amount of gloom. Great, so it's Tuesday, Thalra muttered. What's causing it? Rick paused, which was never a good sign. Looks like the main translocator's fried itself, probably taking the rest of the station with it. Might want to tell everyone to pack light and say their prayers. Never took you for the religious type, Rick. I'm not, but it's amazing what impending doom does for your faith. Thalra sighed and flicked the intercom switch. Attention, everyone. We've got a minor inconvenience. Our teleportation hub's crapped out and we're experiencing technical difficulties. Please remain calm while we fix this. Or die trying. The station was a melting pot of species, unified by their shared disdain for bland station food and the occasional brush with death. Humans, aliens, and things that defied categorization milled about in the common areas, all now looking worriedly at the flashing lights and rumbling walls. Down in the engineering section, Zek, a creature resembling a cross between a scaly dragon and a neon sign, was having a hell of a day. His vibrant scales pulsed with agitation as he wrestled with a particularly stubborn piece of machinery. Damned humans and their overly complicated gadgets, he growled, his voice like gravel being poured over a speaker. Hey, without us, you'd still be rubbing sticks together for warmth, chimed in Terry, the station's chief engineer, her voice the epitome of human confidence with a smidge of condescension. Zek's eyes, glowing with irritation, rolled dramatically. Yes, thank you for the gift of malfunctioning technology. Up in the control center, Thalra was still trying to coax some sense out of the malfunctioning systems. Rick, can we jury-rig the translocator into something less lethal? Love your optimism, but unless you've got a magic wand hidden somewhere, I'd say our chances are slim. So you're saying there's a chance? Thalra grinned despite herself. There was something liberating about a crisis, not unlike a surprise party where everyone might die. The door to the command room slid open with a grating hiss, admitting Carter, a techie with a perpetually disheveled look, as if he just wrestled a tornado and lost. Commander, you've got to see this, he panted, eyes wide with a mix of excitement and terror. Unless it's a way off this death trap, it can wait. Carter shook his head, shoving a tablet into her hands. No, seriously. Look, Thalra glanced at the screen, which showed a grainy video feed from one of the lower decks. Shadows moved erratically across the walls, shapes she couldn't quite make out. Some looked vaguely humanoid, others less so. We've got company, Carter explained unnecessarily. Fantastic. Because what we need right now is a mystery guest list. Commander, these weren't here before the malfunction, Carter insisted, his voice edging towards panic. Ghosts in the machine? Thalra asked, hoping sarcasm would keep her own fear at bay. More like gremlins, Carter mumbled. Thalra shot a look at Rick, who was already pulling up the station's security protocols. Let's hope they're not hungry gremlins. As if on cue, the lights flickered ominously, as though the station was winking at them with malicious intent. The rumbling beneath their feet grew more insistent, the sound of metal protesting violently against its own existence. Back in the engineering bay, Zek wasn't faring much better. "Terry, this is not what I signed up for," he grunted, wrestling with a stubborn panel. "When you said come see the universe, you didn't mention come die in a malfunctioning death trap." Terry grinned, wiping engine grease off her face with a rag. "Welcome to the wonderful world of space travel. Bet you miss your swamps now, huh?" Zek snorted, a sound like a steam engine giving up on life. "At least in the swamp, when something tried to eat you, it was straightforward. Don't worry, I'm sure whatever's lurking out there has clear intentions." She tapped her wrench against the panel with a reassuring clank. "Now help me fix this, or we're all gonna be space debris." Meanwhile, up top, Thaura was pacing like a caged animal, her mind racing through the ever-dwindling list of options. "Okay, let's sum up," she muttered to herself, a habit she'd picked up over years of not dying in space. "Station's trying to kill us, we've got mystery guests, and the only thing working properly is the coffee machine." Rick, who had the misfortune of being within earshot, looked up. "You know, for once I'd like a crisis that doesn't involve imminent death." "Be careful what you wish for," Thaura shot back. "Last time I asked for a calm day, we got invaded by space pirates, and they were lousy tippers," Rick added, typing furiously on his console. The intercom buzzed again, and Thaura braced herself for more bad news. "Commander, this is Targ," came the deep, resonant voice of their resident diplomat, a hulking, tentacled mass of charisma and tentacles. "I believe I've made contact with one of the, entities." "Great, did you invite them for dinner?" Thaura quipped, rubbing at the persistent headache forming between her eyes. "Actually, they seem quite interested in our technological capabilities." "By interested, you mean intent on dismantling us piece by piece?" Targ hesitated. "That possibility has not been ruled out, Commander." "Perfect. Because what's a day in space without a little existential terror?" Thaura took a deep breath, feeling the weight of command like a particularly uncooperative boulder. "All right, people. Let's pretend we know what we're doing and try not to die." "Sound good," the station groaned again, louder this time as if mocking her attempt at morale boosting. Thaura glared at the nearest wall. "Oh, shut up." As plans went, it was thin. But then thin plans had a habit of turning into miracles, or at least moderately successful disasters. She glanced at Rick, who was still hammering away at his console. "Anything on the guests, nothing concrete. But whatever they are, they're not friendly, and they're definitely not here to admire the view. Figures. I knew we should have installed those tourist attraction signs." Rick snorted. "Yeah, because come see the galaxy's largest death trap would bring them running." Thaura turned back to the intercom. "Okay, team, let's focus on not getting blown to hell. Targ, keep chatting with our new friends. See if they want anything besides our untimely demise. Terry, Zek, you're on make sure we don't explode duty." Everyone else tried to look busy. She cut the connection and leaned back in her chair, eyes tracking the oscillating lights above. "Here's hoping we don't die. At least not today." The station shuddered again, and Thaura felt the familiar thrill of impending doom. Maybe it wasn't the way she'd planned to start her week, but then, plans were overrated. Especially in space. As the shadows on the monitors continued their erratic dance, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, this was all a cosmic joke, and she was the punchline. But for now, all she could do was laugh along. Thaura Garin stood at the command console with a look of grim determination that mostly concealed her exasperation. The teleportation hub was doing its best impersonation of a pinball machine, lights flashing, alarms dinging, mechanical bits shifting in ways positively unapproved by the maintenance manual. But here she was, managing an apocalypse with a smile and a half-empty cup of lukewarm synth coffee. She flicked the comm switch to engineering. "Terry, Zek, I need a status update." "Are we dead, dying, or merely circling?" the drained Terry's voice crackled through with the enthusiasm of someone facing a root canal. "We're not dead yet. But I've got Zek here making origami out of the wiring. We're playing the how many limbs will I lose game." Taking bets if you're interested. 2 limbs, Thaura replied, glancing at Rick, who was furiously tapping on his console like it owed him money. And I'll raise you a life sentence. Deal, Zek growled, audible over the din of his struggles. Promise to visit me in the scrapyard, Rick interrupted, looking up from his display. Commander, I think I've figured out what's happening. You're not going to like it, Thaura sighed. Why start liking things now? Our main translocator, in its infinite wisdom, decided to attempt a mind merge for enhanced coordination. It thought networking everyone's brains would help us run the station with the efficiency of a synchronized swimming team. Rick's sardonic chuckle was as dry as the desert planets he loathed. Only problem is, it backfired. Thaura blanched. So, what you're saying is the station tried to shove us into its version of a group chat and accidentally opened a can of cosmic hallucinations, pretty much. Technology, can't live without it, can't live with it trying to steal your mind. Wonderful. So now we're not only playing host to interstellar squatters, but our brains are hosting a carnival. Just when you think things can't get worse, the universe goes, hold my beer. Rick gave a half smile, though his eyes remained glued to the console. I'm already seeing weird things in the corner of my eye. Like my mother, except she's 20 feet tall and made of shadows. So yeah, slightly unsettling. Maybe it's trying to tell you to call home more often, Thaura quipped, rubbing her temples. All right, what's our move? Suggestions, solutions, bribes to appease the great beyond, Rick shrugged. Fixing the translocator might stop the hallucinations, but that's assuming we don't end up stapling our sanity to the ceiling first. Given how this day's going, that's an optimistic scenario. Thaura took a deep breath, feeling the walls closing in, or maybe that was just her imagination. All right, keep working on that. In the meantime, I'll see if I can keep the crew from diving headfirst into the deep end of crazy. She clicked off the intercom and turned to Carter, who had been silently absorbing the chaos. Carter, I'm going to need you to do what you do best. Panic not yet. Get down to the lower decks and see if you can figure out what's actual reality and what's just a brain fart. Carter nodded, face pale but determined. Got it, I'll take notes. If I survive, good man. And Carter, yeah, if you see anything that looks like an interdimensional horror or your mother-in-law, run. Understood, Carter grinned, making a hasty exit. Thaura turned back to Rick. Let's hope our sanity holds long enough for someone to write a cautionary tale about this mess. On the lower decks, Carter was doing his best interpretation of a man on a mission, albeit one who was half convinced he might find a monster under his bed. The corridors stretched into an endless maze of shadows, each corner potentially hiding something that might have crawled out of a fever dream. He paused at a junction, squinting into the dim light. Was that a whisper, or just the air ducts playing their usual tricks? Come on, Carter. Pull yourself together, he mumbled, trying to convince himself that this was just another Tuesday on Vortex Relay 7. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with a specter of his own imagination, only to realize it was Terry, looking as disheveled and grease-stained as ever. Terry, you're not a hallucination, right? She blinked at him. If I am, I'm the most tired one you'll ever meet. What are you doing down here? Thaura's orders. We're trying to distinguish reality from the station's latest trick. Any luck on your end? Terry snorted. Luck. That left the station with our last resupply. I'm working with Zek to stabilize the core, but it's like trying to patch a starship with duct tape and good intentions. Carter appreciated the honesty, if not the grimness of it. Need a hand if you've got one to spare, sure. But don't get too comfortable. I hear the hallucinations are lovely this time of year. Meanwhile, Thaura was back in the command center, watching Rick as he continued to wrestle with the controls. How's it looking? Rick didn't look up. Like a toddler, finger-painted the system's innards. There's no rhyme or reason. Just chaos. Thaura leaned over his shoulder, peering at the data streams. And here I thought technology was supposed to make things easier. Yeah, right after it makes things worse. But there's a silver lining. I think I've isolated the rogue code, Rick said, finally looking up with a gleam of hope in his eyes. So, What's the plan? Shut down the translocator, reboot the system, and pray to whatever cosmic force is listening that it doesn't blow us all to high heaven. Thaura hesitated. Shutting it down will leave us vulnerable to our guests. You realize that, right? Better than going mad while debating existential dread with your hallucinations, Rick replied. She couldn't argue with that. All right, do it. Let's see if we can't pull back from the brink. Rick's fingers flew over the console, executing a series of commands that would either save them or doom them in a spectacularly final way. The lights flickered in protest, the station groaning as if aware of its impending lobotomy. In engineering, Zek and Terry felt the surge, the vibrating hum of the translocator winding down. Feels like they're actually doing it, Zek remarked, pausing in his work. Terry wiped her brow. Here's hoping it doesn't end with us as debris. Carter, caught between the engineering team and his own nervous thoughts, gave a chuckle that sounded more like a hiccup. You know, I always wanted to go out with a bang, just not literally. You and me both, Terry agreed, a rare moment of solidarity in the swirling chaos. Back in the command center, Thaura and Rick watched for signs of improvement. Seconds passed like hours, tension coiling tighter with every breath they held. And then, suddenly, the lights steadied, the alarms fell silent, and the oppressive weight lifting ever so slightly. Did it work? Thaura asked, barely daring to hope. Rick leaned back in his chair, looking more relieved than he'd been in days. I think it might have. The hallucinations should start fading away. Thaura let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Good. Now we just have to deal with whatever's left. The intercom crackled and Terry's voice came through, tinged with cautious optimism. Commander, we're stable for now, but something's still lurking in the lower decks. Terrific. A new challenge for our little circus of horrors. Thaura couldn't help but smile despite everything. They were far from out of the woods, but at least they weren't lost in a forest of their own nightmares anymore. All right, team, regroup and prepare. We've got one more party crasher to deal with, and I'd rather not send them a gift basket. Rick gave her a sidelong glance. You know, for a commander, you're awfully good at improvising, comes with the territory. Plus, it's either that or go mad with the rest of you. As the station settled into an uneasy calm, Thaura pondered the next steps, the weight of leadership a familiar companion. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning, but for now, at least, they had a fighting chance. And that, in the grand scheme of things, was more than she'd hoped for. Thaura Garin leaned back in her chair, feeling the familiar twinge of a headache squeezing her temples like a vice. The command center was supposed to be a place of calculated decisions and competence, not a front-row seat to an existential horror show. But here they were, sanity hanging by a thread as they tried to unravel the mess left by an overzealous translocator. All right, Rick, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Let's see how this plays out. Keep an eye on the readouts and let me know if the station decides to play ghosts of crew members past again. Will do, Commander, Rick replied, his tone the verbal equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Just as long as it doesn't involve my ex-wife dropping by. That woman's scarier than any hallucination. Good to know your standards for horror are consistent, Thaura shot back with a smirk. The intercom buzzed again. This time it was Dr. Mickle Reeve, the station's resident scientist/mad genius. Commander, I have a proposition that might help us regain control. Proposition or suicide mission? Thaura asked, not bothering to hide her skepticism. Bit of column A, bit of column B, Reeve replied, his voice carrying the distinct lilt of a man who'd spent too much time contemplating the mysteries of the universe and not enough time practicing social skills. Meet me in Lab Delta. I'll explain everything. I'm not going to like this, am I? No promises, Reeve said, and the line clicked dead. Thaura sighed, glancing at Rick. Keep the ship running, or what's left of it anyway. I'm off to see what brand of insanity Reeve is selling today. Don't take any wooden credits, Rick advised, already turning back to his console. Down in Lab Delta, Thaura found Mickle Reeve hunched over a cluster of screens. each displaying a kaleidoscope of equations and diagrams that looked more like modern art than anything comprehensible. Reeve was tall and lean, with hair that seemed in perpetual rebellion against anything resembling order. He looked up as she entered, his eyes bright with the kind of excitement that usually ended with someone losing an appendage. "Commander," he began, gesturing at the screens with an enthusiasm that implied he had a solution, or at least a theory masquerading as one. "I believe we can isolate the mind merge effects." "Really? And how many neurons does that cost?" Thalra asked, arms crossed. "Fewer than you'd think. I've been analyzing the rogue code," Reeve continued, tapping an equation that might have been offensive in some regions of the galaxy. "The translocator's mind merge was meant to network our brains for better coordination, right? I recall hearing that somewhere," Thalra replied dryly. "Well, it didn't just plug us into a bad group chat. It also linked to some kind of cosmic interference, anomalies we hadn't accounted for." Thalra rubbed her forehead. "So not only are we victims of our own tech, but the universe decided to throw in a bonus round." "Exactly," Reeve said, as if she'd grasped the very essence of his genius. "And your plan? We could create a counter-frequency, essentially a firewall for the brain." "Right. And the catch? Well, there's about a 40% chance it could fry our synapses and turn our brains into mushy puddles," he admitted almost gleefully. 40%, you say? Great odds for a game of Russian roulette," Thalra muttered. "Anything else I should know? Only that I haven't actually tested it, but it should work theoretically." "Fantastic," Thalra said deadpan. "Isn't it amazing how should work and definitely won't kill us all are two entirely different things?" As she was about to respond further, the comms crackled to life with Carter's voice, trembling with a mix of fear and exhilaration. "Commander, you've got to get down here. The lower decks, well, let's just say the universe is hosting a surprise party and we're the guests of honor." "Sounds delightful," Thalra quipped. "Reeve, keep working on your miracle. I'll deal with the interdimensional party favors." The corridors to the lower decks were bathed in a sickly, flickering light that did nothing to improve Thalra's mood. She found Carter standing in a hallway, eyes wide and darting between shadows that seemed to move just outside his peripheral vision. "Is it just me," Carter began, "or have the walls started whispering sweet nothings? Because I swear one of them just asked me about my childhood trauma." "You're not alone," Thalra assured him. "Turns out our esteemed scientist has a plan. The good news is it might fix this mess. The bad news is it might also scramble our brains like eggs." "Well, that's a comfort," Carter said, scratching his chin. "Better than having the station give me an unsolicited therapy session." "So what's our move?" "First, we figure out how to handle whatever's down here, preferably without becoming its new best friends," Thalra said, peering into the gloom. "Any volunteers?" "I think I'm already on that list," Carter replied, pointing to a door that seemed to pulse with an eerie greenish glow. "That can't be standard issue. Let's investigate and hope it doesn't involve dissection," Thalra muttered, moving towards the door. Inside, the room was awash in a strange luminescence that cast shadows in all the wrong places. The air was thick, buzzing with an energy that thrummed in Thalra's bones. She could feel her skin tingling, her mind flickering with images that weren't hers. "Well," Carter said, his voice high with forced nonchalance, "this is cozy." "Cozy like a coffin," Thalra agreed, trying to focus. But the room seemed to shift and pulse with a life of its own. The hallucinations had started subtly, pictures from her past blurring with impossible scenes, a family dinner that was suddenly a battlefield, laughter turning to screams. It was as if her brain was a broken projector, flashes of reality and unreality looping in a maddening cycle. "Thalra," Carter's voice cut through the haze, "I think we need to leave. Now." "Agreed," she said, backing towards the door. "This place is having too much fun with our heads." As they stumbled out into the corridor, Thalra's comm link buzzed with a message from Rick. "Commander, we've got movement topside. Something's trying to access the mainframe and it's not friendly." "Perfect," Thalra groaned. "I'll head there. Carter, regroup with Terry and Zek. Make sure engineering stays in one piece. Aye, aye, Carter replied, already moving. Back in the command center, Thaura found Rick staring at the screens, his face a study in grim determination. Looks like our cosmic friend decided to go digital, he said, tapping at his console. Let me guess, Thaura said. Hackers from another dimension. More like a virus with a sense of humor, Rick replied. It's trying to override the systems, probably to welcome more unwanted guests. Is it bad that I'd rather deal with an alien invasion than more of Reeves' theoretical physics? Thaura muttered, leaning over his shoulder. I'm starting to think Reeves' plan might be the lesser of two evils, Rick admitted. But we need to buy some time. Thaura nodded, her mind racing. All right, I'll distract our persistent intruder. You try to isolate it, lock it out, or at least slow it down. We can't let it have full run of the place. Consider it done, Rick said, fingers flying across the console. As Thaura moved to the auxiliary controls, trying to reroute power and communications, she couldn't help but marvel at the sheer absurdity of it all. Here they were, stuck on Vortex Relay 7, battling hallucinations, rogue code, and potential cosmic invaders. Just another day at the office. Rick, any luck? She called, glancing at the screens. Some, he replied, but I'm going to need more juice if we want to keep this thing from getting too cozy. Pull it from life support if you have to, Thaura said, half joking. If we're going down, let's at least do it on our terms. Rick grinned, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Remind me never to play cards with you, Commander. As the minutes ticked by, the station's systems flickered, the lights dipping low before surging back with renewed vigor. Thaura could feel the tension in the air, a taut wire ready to snap. All right, Rick, she said, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, sharpening her focus. Let's see if we can make this thing regret ever setting digital foot on our station. In the end, it was a game of cat and mouse, with Thaura and Rick racing against whatever intelligence had taken hold of their systems. It was exhausting, nerve-wracking work, but finally, with a triumphant whoop, Rick managed to lock out the intruder, sealing it behind layers of firewalls and security protocols. Not bad for a day's work, Thaura said, leaning back and feeling the weight of fatigue settle in. Assuming we survive Reeves' plan, we're throwing a party. And by party, I mean collapsing quietly in our quarters. Sounds like a plan, Rick replied, visibly relieved. For a moment, everything was still. The station, for all its quirks and hazards, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they had averted disaster for the time being. Commander, if I may, Rick said, looking up from his console. You're not too bad at this whole saving-the-day thing. Don't get used to it, Thaura replied, a tired grin pulling at her lips. I'm only human after all. As they prepared for the next phase of their precarious survival, Thaura couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something far larger than themselves. But for now, they'd managed to keep the madness at bay, and in the grand scheme of things, that was victory enough. Thaura sat in the command center, eyes glued to the screens, trying to ignore the persistent throbbing in her temples that seemed to have taken up permanent residence. The station hummed with a low, menacing growl, and every so often the lights flickered, as though the universe was testing the dimmer switch on their reality. Rick, she called, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that always accompanied silence in space. How's that containment coming? Rick, his eyes bloodshot from hours of staring at code, muttered something unintelligible in the way only someone who hadn't slept in 2 days could. It's like trying to keep water in a sieve, he finally said, but I think we've got a handle on it. For now. Great, Thaura replied, injecting as much false optimism into her voice as she could muster. Let's hope for now means longer than 5 minutes this time. As if on cue, Terry's voice crackled over the comms, dripping with sarcasm as usual. Commander, you might want to get down to engineering. We've got a situation. Of course we do, Thaura muttered, pushing herself up. Why get comfortable when we can run around putting out fires instead? That's the spirit, Rick quipped as she left, his fingers dancing across the console in a grim ballet of desperation. The walk to engineering was punctuated by the occasional distant scream from a crew member experiencing a particularly vivid hallucination. Just another cheerful day aboard Vortex Relay 7. Thaura found Terry and Zek hunched over a mass of sparking wires, engaged in what appeared to be a heated debate about which limb one of them was going to lose. "What's the latest disaster?" Thaura asked, crossing her arms. "We've got a full system meltdown brewing," Terry replied, throwing a wrench at a nearby panel in frustration. "The translocator's gone haywire. Again." "It's like a teenager in a mood swing." "And the hallucinations?" Thaura inquired, running a hand through her hair. "Getting worse," Zek said, his expression serious. "The walls are starting to look like my ex-wife's lawyer, unpredictable and out for blood." "Charming," Thaura sighed. "Any bright ideas on how to fix it?" "Well, unless you fancy a lobotomy, we're fresh out of bright ideas," Terry replied. "Reeves' plan was our best shot, but it seems our brains enjoy being scrambled eggs too much." "Fantastic," Thaura groaned. "And just when I thought we'd hit rock bottom." As if summoned by their sheer exasperation, a group of the station's alien crew members shuffled in, their leader, a hulking, chitinous creature named K.R.'s, clicking its mandibles in what could only be described as annoyance. "Commander Garin," K.R.'s began, the translator struggling to capture the full nuance of its condescension. "We have concerns about the current leadership's ability to navigate this crisis." "You now," Thaura replied, her voice dripping with forced politeness. "And here I thought we were doing just fine, what with all the hallucinations and impending doom." "Irrelevant," K.R.'s continued, waving a claw dismissively. "Human emotional instability is compromising our efforts. Our people believe it may be time for a change in command." "Oh, you do you?" Thaura said, narrowing her eyes. "And what makes you think you'd handle it any better? Last I checked, this lovely mess was a group effort." K.R.'s eyes glinted with something akin to smugness. "Our cognitive structure is less susceptible to the interference. We could provide a more logical approach, free from human eccentricities." "Right, because logical is exactly what this situation calls for," Thaura retorted, sarcasm dripping from her words. "I suppose you just calmly suggest we surrender to our new multidimensional overlords." "Better than flailing in chaos," K.R. said, folding its arms, or whatever close approximation it had. Thaura took a deep breath, willing herself not to punch an alien diplomat in the face. "Okay, let's say you take over. What then? You think the rogue code will just politely ask for your command authority?" K.R.'s silence was answer enough. "Thought so," Thaura continued. "Look, I'm not saying we humans are perfect, far from it. But this isn't a situation that logic alone can fix. We need creativity, adaptability, a willingness to make the unpredictable work for us." "An ego," K.R. added, raising an eyebrow ridge. "That too," Thaura admitted. "But ego's gotten us pretty far, hasn't it? And besides, in case you haven't noticed, this human is still standing, still fighting to keep us all alive." There was an uncomfortable silence as K.R. considered her words. Finally, it exhaled a reluctant, static-laden sigh. "We will continue to monitor the situation, but know that my people are ready to intervene should your leadership prove untenable." "Oh, I wouldn't expect anything less," Thaura replied brightly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got a station to save." As K.R. and its entourage departed, Terry gave Thaura a look that was equal parts admiration and pity. "Diplomatic prowess of a sledgehammer," she said, "but effective." "I aim to please," Thaura said, rolling her eyes. "Now let's get back to the pressing matter of not dying." Zek nodded, his eyes flicking back to the tangled mess of wires. "Should we try Reeves' plan one more time?" "Why not?" Thaura said, shrugging. "After all, who needs fully functioning synapses anyway?" "Spoken like a true optimist," Terry deadpanned, handing Thaura a toolkit. "Let's do this before I start seeing unicorns dancing on the hull." With a combination of grim determination and a complete disregard for their own sanity, the team set to work. The Iors slipped by in a haze of sparks and electrical burns, each minute ticking closer to the inevitable conclusion. They were trapped in an absurdist parody of a science fiction nightmare. "Any brilliant revelations?" Thaura asked at one point, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Only that I should have gone into animal husbandry instead," Zek grumbled, wincing as a wire zapped his fingers. "Too late for career advice," Terry said, squinting at a particularly vexing junction. "We're in this mess till the bitter, possibly gooey end." "Just the pep talk I needed," Thaura replied, voice laced with sarcasm. Suddenly, the station shook violently, a low rumble echoing through its corridors like the ominous bellyache of an ancient beast. Alarms blared, red lights bathing them in a devilish glow that did nothing to help morale. "What now?" Thaura shouted, bracing herself against a console as the shaking subsided. "Looks like the main translocator's gone rogue," Terry yelled over the clamor. "It's trying to engage independently." "Because of course it is," Thaura muttered. "Why fix what isn't broken when you can break what isn't fixed?" A call came through the comms, barely audible over the cacophony. It was Rick, sounding more frantic than she'd ever heard him. "Commander, the systems are failing. We're losing life support, gravity control, everything. Pull whatever resources you can to keep us running," Thaura ordered, voice steady despite the chaos. "And see if you can get through to Reeve." "We might need another harebrained scheme." "On it," Rick replied, already cutting the connection. Thaura turned to her team, her mind racing. "All right, folks, it's do or die time. We need to isolate that translocator and shut it down manually if we have to. Ideas? Could try feeding it a surge," Zek suggested. "Shock it into submission. Or we could reroute power from non-essential systems," Terry offered. "Starve it out, so to speak. Or," Thaura said, a dark grin spreading across her face, "we just blow the damn thing up." The team looked at her in disbelief, but she could see the wheels turning. In the mad logic of their predicament, it wasn't the worst idea she'd ever had. "That's actually not terrible," Terry said after a pause, "though it might also take us with it." "High risk, high reward," Thaura replied. "Besides, we might not have another choice." With grim resolve, they set to work on their desperate plan, cobbling together a solution that was equal parts genius and insanity. The station groaned in protest as they diverted power and overrode safety protocols, each action pushing them closer to either salvation or oblivion. As they worked, Thaura couldn't help but feel a strange sense of camaraderie, a shared understanding that, despite the insanity, they were all in this together. And if they were going to go out, they'd do it on their own terms, laughing in the face of cosmic absurdity. Finally, it was done. They stood back, breathless and exhausted, staring at the jury-rigged setup that was either their salvation or their doom. "Ready?" Thaura asked, heart pounding. "Not in the slightest," Zek replied, a nervous chuckle escaping him. "Can't wait to see how this plays out," Terry added, her voice a shaky mix of fear and exhilaration. With a deep breath, Thaura initiated the sequence. The station shuddered, the lights flaring with blinding intensity before plunging them into darkness. Alarms screamed, and for a moment, Thaura thought they were done for. But then, like a miracle born of madness, the hum of the translocator sputtered and died. Silence enveloped them, the absence of chaos as profound as its presence had been. Thaura let out a slow, incredulous breath. "Did we just?" "I think we did," Zek said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned," Terry murmured, a grin spreading across her face. "We actually pulled it off." Thaura allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Guess that means we get to live another day." In the dim light of the emergency systems, they shared a moment of quiet satisfaction. The crisis wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they'd won a small victory, and that was enough for now. Because in the grand theater of the universe, sometimes all you could do was laugh in the face of the absurdity and hope you didn't trip on the curtains on your way out. The lights flickered like they wanted to be anywhere else, and frankly, Thaura couldn't blame them. Vortex Relay 7 shuddered again, almost like an asthmatic giant trying to catch its breath. Alarms were singing their merry little tune, and the air had that crisp, just burnt electronic smell. If she squinted and ignored the blaring sirens, she could almost pretend she was on a particularly noisy beach with seagulls that screamed bloody murder. "Rick," Thaura called out as she clung to her command console like a lifeboat in a storm. "Tell me you've got some good news before I start rationing air." Rick's voice crackled over the comms, full of the kind of exhaustion that only a marathon runner who accidentally signed up for an ultramarathon could understand. "Let's just say if our situation was a horse, they'd have shot it by now." "Optimism, that's the spirit," Thaura muttered, massaging her temples. Her headache was setting up camp and inviting all its friends over for a rave. She turned to Terry and Zek, who were elbow-deep in what used to be a perfectly functioning console. "Got any of those genius ideas left, or did we use them all up last crisis?" Terry made a show of looking thoughtful. "How about we all hold our breath and hope the station decides to be nice?" Or, Zek chimed in, "we could try Dr. Reeves' latest suggestion, though calling it a suggestion might be an insult to actual suggestions." "What's the plan this time?" Thaura asked, already feeling the dread tickling her spine. "Well," Terry said, trying to keep a straight face, "Reeve thinks we should try manually resetting the hub systems. You know, like turning it off and on again." "That's what we've come to," Thaura replied, barely suppressing a laugh. "The fate of humanity rests on IT-101. Hey, it's either that or start building a raft out of coffee mugs and hope we drift to safety," Zek added, giving a wire one last tug. "Great. Just great," Thaura said, shaking her head. "Gather everyone, we're going for a low-tech miracle." The rest of the crew assembled in the teleportation hub, looking like they'd just finished a long shift in the mines of despair. Dr. Mickle Reeve joined them, his wild hair and even wilder eyes a testament to the many nights spent away from restful slumber. "Ah, the gang's all here," Reeve said, rubbing his hands together. "Shall we embark on what I optimistically refer to as Plan Z?" "Plan Z?" Thaura echoed, raising an eyebrow. "What happened to plans A through Y? Let's just say they involved slightly less plausible science and a bit more imagination," Reeve replied with a smirk. "Sounds about right," Thaura said. "All right, folks, gather round. Time to talk strategy." She laid out their plan with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for explaining how taxes work. "We're going to manually reset the main translocator, which means we need to get into the belly of the beast and poke it until it behaves." "Sounds like a party," Zek said. "Do we bring gifts?" "Only if you count not dying as a gift," Thaura shot back. "Good thing I didn't bring flowers," Terry added, checking the charge on her plasma cutter. The team moved with the kind of determination that only comes when everything else has already failed. They made their way through the dimly lit corridors, past sparking conduits and groaning bulkheads, until they reached the central hub. It loomed before them, a hulking reminder that even the most advanced technology had a tendency to throw a tantrum at the worst possible moment. "All right, Reeve," Thaura said, gesturing to the console. "You're the brains. How do we tickle this thing back to life?" Reeve ran a hand through his hair, which was sticking out in every direction like a demented porcupine. "Simple," he said. "We overload the auxiliary circuits, force a hard reset, and hope it doesn't blow us to kingdom come." "And if it does?" Zek asked. "We'll have a lovely light show to send us off," Reeve replied, flashing a grin that was more manic than reassuring. "Great. Love a good fireworks display," Terry said, rolling her eyes. The team set to work, each member moving with the precision of a chaos-trained ballet troupe. Wires were yanked, circuits were bridged, and more than a few choice expletives were shared. It was the kind of camaraderie that only came from facing certain doom together. As Thaura watched her crew, she couldn't help but marvel at the sheer audacity of humanity. Faced with the cold indifference of the universe, they responded in the only way they knew how, with a shrug, a chuckle, and a stubborn refusal to go quietly. "All right, it's ready," Reeve announced, stepping back from the console. "Fingers crossed." "Or not," Thaura said. "We might need them." With one last nod, Thaura activated the sequence. The hub whirred to life, lights flickering like they couldn't decide whether to stay on or off. The station shook again, a bone-rattling tremor that made everyone grab for something solid. Thaura held her breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion. But it didn't come. Instead, the lights steadied, the alarms quieted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a semblance of calm settled over the station. "Did it work?" Terry asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and hope. "I'm not dead, so I'm taking that as a yes," Zek replied, looking around as if expecting something to go wrong just to spite him. Thaura let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Looks like we're not decorating the vacuum today." "Disappointing, really," Reeves said, shaking his head. "I was quite looking forward to drifting aimlessly through space." "Maybe next time," Thaura replied, clapping him on the back. The crew shared a moment of victorious silence, the kind that said they'd managed to pull off another miracle. Of course, they all knew it was just a temporary reprieve. The station was still teetering on the brink, and the main translocator was still a ticking time bomb. "All right, everyone," Thaura said, her voice a blend of relief and resolve. "Let's not waste this miracle. We've got life support systems to stabilize and a few million other problems to fix. If I didn't know better, I'd think you liked this job," Terry teased, giving her a sideways look. "Don't be ridiculous," Thaura retorted. "I just thrive in chaos." With a renewed sense of purpose, the team split up to tackle the myriad issues that still plagued the station. Despite the looming threat, their spirits were buoyed by the simple fact that they'd managed to survive yet another day. Rick reappeared with a stack of reports, looking slightly less sleep-deprived than before, but only just. "Commander," he said, his face a mask of barely contained exasperation. "Life support stabilized for now, but we're running on fumes. We'll need to scavenge parts from the non-essential systems." "Do it," Thaura said, not missing a beat. "Strip this place bare if you have to. I'd rather have air to breathe than a functioning karaoke machine." "Good call," Rick muttered, scribbling on his pad. As they worked, the crew couldn't help but exchange dark jokes about their situation. Gallows humor was the glue that held them together, and each quip was a reminder that however dire things seemed, they still had each other. "I was thinking," Zek said as he jimmied a stubborn panel back into place, "we could write a book when this is all over. How to Not Die in Space, a comedy." "Catchy title," Terry replied, tightening a bolt. "I'll write the chapter on advanced techniques in panic management. I'll handle creative swearing under pressure," Thaura added with a wry grin. Despite the fatigue, the crew kept moving, driven by a combination of determination and sheer stubbornness. The station might have been on the verge of collapse, but they refused to go down without a fight. As the hours ticked by, Thaura found herself in the command center once more, reviewing the data and contemplating their next move. The main translocator still loomed as a threat, and the cosmic hallucinations were a ticking time bomb of their own. "We're not out of the woods yet," she muttered to herself, staring at the readouts as if they might offer some morsel of wisdom. "Talking to yourself, Commander?" Reeve asked, appearing at her side with the quiet stealth of someone who spent too much time in labs. "Just trying to convince this station to behave," she replied, half smiling. "Think it's working?" Reeve chuckled. "I've found that machines are a lot like people. They rarely do what you want unless you threaten them with a hammer." "I'll keep that in mind," Thaura said, her eyes back on the console. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of activity, each crew member playing their part in keeping Vortex Relay 7 from tearing itself apart. They may have been a ragtag group of misfits, but together they were a force to be reckoned with. Finally, as the day wound down, Thaura called the crew together for a quick debrief. They gathered in the command center, their faces weary but defiant. "All right, folks, we're still in one piece," Thaura began, looking each of them in the eye. "I know it feels like we're playing a game of cosmic whack-a-mole, but we're making progress." "Slowly," Rick interjected with a dry smile. "But surely," Thaura countered. "And that's what matters. As long as we're still kicking, we've got a chance." "And if we kick the bucket?" Zek asked, half joking. "Then we haunt the station and scare the hell out of whoever replaces us," Thaura replied with a wink. Laughter rippled through the group, a balm for their frayed nerves. With the meeting adjourned, the crew dispersed, each heading off to their next task or a rare moment of rest. Thalra remained behind, taking a moment to appreciate the fragile piece they'd managed to carve out of chaos. She knew the road ahead was fraught with challenges, each more daunting than the last. But for now, they'd won a small victory, and she intended to savor it, however fleeting. After all, in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't the battles that defined them, but the defiant laughter in the face of certain doom. And for Thalra Garin and her crew, that was enough. At least until the next crisis reared its ugly head. But that was a problem for tomorrow. The metallic groan of Vortex Relay 7's innards was like a suite full of hungover banshees. Thalra Garin clung to her command console like it might suddenly sprout wings and fly off without her. The station had been temperamental, even before the translocator had a meltdown, and tried to shove everyone's consciousness into one awkward mental cocktail party. "All right, people," she called out, voice straining over the ambient chaos. "We've got a station to save, assuming it doesn't kill us first. Ideas other than running." Rick piped up from the comms, his voice crackling with static and fatigue. "Got a killer deal on a second-hand escape pod. Tempting, but I'm not in the market for a coffin with a view," Thalra replied, squinting at the readouts. Somewhere a console beeped in the tone of a cat being stepped on, and she sighed. "How's life support?" "Like a teenager after a breakup, touch and go," Rick grumbled. "Fantastic," Thalra muttered, "because I've got a real hankering for asphyxiation." Meanwhile, Terry and Zek were hunched over the open guts of a panel, tools in hand, exchanging expletives like love letters. "You know, Zek," Terry said, brushing a stray wire out of her hair, "I always dreamed of dying in my sleep. Preferably old and in a bed." "Don't worry," he shot back, fingers nimbly twisting a connector into place. "After today, you'll never dream of anything again." Thalra cracked a smile despite herself, then cleared her throat. "Listen up, we need to get the main translocator back online without cooking our brains." "Any volunteers for human sacrifice?" "Is that rhetorical?" Zek asked without looking up. "Mostly, Doctor." Mikkel Reeve, their resident mad scientist, chose that moment to burst in with the kind of energy only caffeine and imminent disaster could provide. His lab coat flapped behind him like a cape, and his hair resembled a bird's nest after a storm. "Commander," he exclaimed, brandishing a tablet like a holy relic. "I've got something. Please tell me it's good news," Thalra said, raising a skeptical eyebrow. "That depends," Reeve replied, grinning like a man who'd just been handed a live grenade. "Do you like living?" "Can't say I'm committed to the idea, but I'm open to it," she said. "What have you got?" "Human psychology," Reeve declared, eyes alight with manic enthusiasm. "Turns out, our minds are uniquely wired to handle chaos and pattern recognition beyond any AI capacity. We can leverage this to shield ourselves from the mind merge effects. Didn't realize our brains were good for more than storing stress and bad decisions," Terry quipped, wiping her hands on her coveralls. "Okay, Doc," Thalra said, folding her arms. "I'm listening." "How does this not end with us drooling into our socks?" Reeve's fingers danced over his tablet, pulling up a dizzying array of data. "It's all about cognitive dissonance. Instead of trying to fight the merge, we lean into it, using our natural ability to compartmentalize conflicting information. And you think this will shield us from cosmic hallucinations?" Rick's voice chimed in, dripping with doubt. "Precisely." Reeve beamed as though he'd just discovered chocolate. "We amplify the signals that reinforce our individual identities, creating a mental firewall of sorts." "Reeve, you beautiful maniac," Thalra said, shaking her head. "You might just get us out of this mess. Or into a bigger one," Zek muttered, still elbow-deep in circuits. "Details, details," Reeve waved a hand dismissively. "We need to reroute the neural feedback loops through the station's mainframe. Terry, Zek, I'll need your help, because who doesn't love last-minute rewiring?" Terry said, rolling her eyes but nodding all the same. Thalra watched them scurry off with Reeve, a bizarre mix of hope and dread swirling in her gut. If they pulled this off, they wouldn't just save the station. They'd all walk away with their minds intact, more or less. "Commander," Rick's voice brought her back to the present. "I've got another lovely update. Power fluctuations in Grid 6. Might want to avoid anything metallic." "Great," she replied. "I'll keep that in mind when I'm plotting our next dance recital." As the crew got to work, the station echoed with the sounds of frantic activity, tools clattering, panels being slammed shut, and the ever-present hum of machinery that could fail at any moment. It was the soundtrack of desperation, with a beat you could really dance to. Thaura moved between workstations, offering the occasional word of encouragement or snarky comment, whichever seemed more necessary at the time. The lights flickered intermittently, casting long, jittery shadows over everything, as if the station itself was having second thoughts. In Lab Delta, Reeve was in his element, directing Terry and Zek as they spliced wires and recalibrated circuits. "Remember," he said, "we're not just fixing a machine. We're reprogramming our brains to outsmart it." "Wonderful," Zek grunted, struggling with a stubborn cable. "I always wanted to be my own worst enemy." "Welcome to the club," Terry replied, securing a connection with a satisfying click. Thaura leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "How's it going, Doc?" "Swimmingly," Reeve said, that manic glint still in his eyes. "I've got a theory that if we can create a feedback loop utilizing our emotional responses, we can effectively trick the translocator. And if not?" Thaura asked, though she already knew the answer. "Well, then we come to terms with living in a shared delusion," Reeve said with a shrug. "Could be worse." "Not gonna lie, I was hoping for more reassurance," Thaura admitted. "Reassurance is for the weak of heart," Reeve replied, not missing a beat. "And last I checked, none of us have that luxury." The hours ticked by in a blur of feverish activity. The crew moved with the kind of grace only desperation could conjure, each action carefully calculated to stave off disaster for just a bit longer. Even as fatigue threatened to drag them down, they powered through, buoyed by the grim determination that had carried them this far. Finally, Reeve's voice crackled over the comms. "We're ready, Commander. Let's see if humanity's greatest strength is its ability to adapt to and thrive in calamity." "Sounds like a plan," Thaura replied, though the back of her mind whispered that it was their only option because the universe was fresh out of miracles. As the crew gathered in the control room, the atmosphere was electric, a mix of anxiety and anticipation. The main translocator loomed overhead, its menacing hum a constant reminder of their predicament. "Everyone ready?" Thaura asked, looking around at the faces of her crew. They nodded, weary but resolute. "Okay, Reeve," she said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." Reeve initiated the sequence, fingers flying over the console. Lights danced across the displays, and the station shivered like a cat that had just been dunked in water. For a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath. Then, the translocator flared to life, a surge of energy coursing through the station like a shot of adrenaline to a dying heart. The crew braced for the inevitable onslaught of hallucinations, but instead, a peculiar sensation washed over them. A sense of clarity, as though a fog had lifted from their minds. "Is it working?" Terry asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I think so," Reeve replied, eyes wide with amazement. "We've created a resonant frequency that stabilizes our individual consciousnesses. It's like tuning a radio to the perfect station. Did we just outsmart a machine with pure human stubbornness?" Zek asked, an incredulous grin spreading across his face. "Seems like it," Thaura replied, a weight lifting from her shoulders. Never underestimate the power of not knowing when to quit. As the realization sank in, a wave of relief and triumph swept through the crew, their laughter echoing through the control room like music. The translocator was no longer a threat. They'd pulled off the impossible, and all it took was a little ingenuity, a lot of courage, and a healthy dose of human resilience. "All right, everyone," Thaura said, her voice steadier than it had been in days. "We've got a station to restore and a universe to remind that we're not going anywhere." With renewed purpose, the crew set to work, tackling the myriad repairs that still awaited them. The station might have been held together with little more than hope and duct tape, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, it finally seemed manageable. As they moved between workstations, exchanging jokes and jibes, Thaura couldn't help but marvel at the tenacity of her crew. They'd faced down the abyss and come out the other side stronger than ever. "Hey, Rick," Zek called out, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Think we should write that book now? How to outsmart a translocator with sheer bloody-mindedness." "At a chapter on finding hope in a hellhole," Rick replied, grinning. "Don't forget the art of snatching victory from the jaws of death," Terry added, tossing a rag at Zek. "Sounds like a bestseller," Thaura said, chuckling as she surveyed the bustling activity around her. In the end, it wasn't the machines or the technology that saved them. It was the unyielding spirit of a group of flawed, stubborn humans who refused to back down. And as Thaura watched her crew, she knew that whatever the universe hurled their way next, they'd face it head-on, with a laugh and a middle finger raised to the stars. The command center of Vortex Relay 7 was in its usual state of barely controlled chaos, a fitting reflection of Thaura Garen's blood pressure. The walls echoed with the hum of overworked machinery, like the world's most dissonant orchestra tuning up for a concert nobody wanted to attend. "Rick, what's the status on those power fluctuations? Please tell me they've calmed down more than my last blind date," Thaura said, her eyes fixed on the command console like it owed her money. "Only if by calm you mean exploded in a shower of sparks," Rick replied, leaning back in his chair with the kind of languor that suggested he'd been doing this job far too long without hazard pay. "Grid 6 is throwing a tantrum. Again. I swear this station has more mood swings than a teenage soap opera." "Well, I hope it's at least a good season finale," Thaura muttered, rubbing at the tension headache forming a second skull around her brain. Terry and Zek were crouched together at the far end of the room, trying to coax some cooperation out of the station's wiring. "Can't wait to see which one of these cables is secretly plotting to murder us in our sleep," Terry said, her voice dry as vacuum. "Probably all of them," Zek grunted, wrestling with a wire that seemed to have developed its own vendetta. "We're one short circuit away from becoming a cautionary tale, or a bad joke," Terry added. "How many engineers does it take to fix a space station?" "Apparently more than 2, Zek said with a grimace, finally managing to twist the cable into submission. A cough of static brought Thaura's attention back to the comms. "Doctor, Reeve, you're still alive, right? Would be inconvenient if you weren't. More alive than the station's wiring, I'm happy to report." Reeve's voice crackled through, tinged with manic cheer. "We're about ready to reset the hub systems and see if we can stop having our minds merged like some cosmic yogurt." "Good," Thaura replied, a hint of relief sneaking past her sarcasm. "I'm not a fan of being part of the universe's worst telepathic group chat." Reeve's laugh was as wild as his hair. "Just a few more calibrations. Terry, Zek, I'll need your hands in the lab again. Let's bring this beast to heel." "On our way," Terry called back, giving Zek a nod. "Time to see if we can play God with a space station and not end up as the punchline, or as smoldering ash," Zek added, ever the optimist. As the 2 engineers headed to Lab Delta, Thaura settled into an uneasy rhythm, her fingers drumming impatiently on the console. The command center felt like a pressure cooker about to blow its top, and she was the unlucky cook trying to keep everything from boiling over. "Commander," Rick said, still tapping away at his own console, "emergency protocols are standing by. Just in case, we all suddenly start speaking Klingon or something." "Appreciate the optimism," Rick, Thaura answered dryly, though she couldn't help but crack a smile at the thought of her crew accidentally inventing a new language. "Let's hope we don't need them." In Lab Delta, the air was thick with the scent of burnt circuits and determination. "Doctor." Reeve darted between monitors like a scientist possessed, or possibly just a scientist with too much caffeine and not enough common sense. "All right, Terry, Zek, We need to reroute the neural feedback loops, channel them through the mainframe's auxiliary circuits. Simple as pie, Zek said, crouching next to a panel and pulling out a tangle of wires that looked more like a cat's cradle than advanced technology. If pie was made of electrical hazards and existential dread, less talk, more action, Terry urged, already elbow-deep in the station's guts. I'd rather not end up sharing my deepest thoughts with all of you. Trust me, it's not a pretty place. Reeve grinned, more to himself than anyone else. Fear not, brave comrades. We're about to bend the laws of cognitive science in our favor. Or at least give them a hearty slap upside the head. As the trio worked, Thaura kept a wary eye on the command center's monitors. Each flicker of the screens, a reminder that Vortex Relay 7 was as stable as a toddler on a trampoline. The sound of metal on metal from the lab was both reassuring and unsettling, a symphony of desperation with a chorus of curses. Finally, Reeve's voice came through the comms again, crackling with both static and enthusiasm. "Commander, we're ready. It's now or never. Let's see if we can convince this bucket of bolts not to fry our brains like overdone fritters." "Music to my ears," Thaura replied, glancing around at her crew, all looking as tense and hopeful as she felt. "Everyone, brace yourselves. This might get a bit interesting." With a few swift commands, Reeve initiated the reset sequence. The station shuddered like a waking beast, lights flickering madly before stabilizing in a steady glow. A moment of silence followed, as though the universe itself was holding its breath. And then, like a slap to the senses, everything clicked back into place. The oppressive mental fog that had been hanging over them dissipated, leaving behind a clarity that felt almost alien in its starkness. "Whoa," Terry said, blinking rapidly as though she could wipe away the remnants of the mind merge with her eyelids. "Did it work? Are we all still us?" "Seems like it," Zek said, rubbing the back of his neck as if checking for new holes. "No choir of cosmic voices in my head, at least." Back in the command center, Thaura let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The air felt lighter, the room clearer. "Rick, status report systems are stable," Rick confirmed, with a note of disbelief. "Life support's back to mostly not trying to kill us, and I'm not feeling like I'm about to start singing the universe's greatest hits." A round of relieved laughter rippled through the room, a sound of victory that tasted sweeter than anything manufactured in a laboratory. "Congratulations, everyone," Thaura said, a wry grin tugging at her lips. "We've just reset the hub systems and avoided becoming a cautionary tale for future space explorers. Or, lunch for whatever cosmic horror lives in the translocator," Zek offered, ever the ray of sunshine. "Details, details," Reeve chimed in, still buzzing with post-success adrenaline. "We've succeeded and nobody even lost a limb. I'd call that a win." The triumphant mood was infectious. Thaura watched her crew move with renewed energy, tackling the remaining repairs with a vigor that hadn't been there before. The station, once a prison, now felt almost like home, a home that tried to kill them occasionally, but home nonetheless. "All right, crew," Thaura said, clapping her hands to get their attention. "We've still got a lot of work to do. Let's patch up the rest of this tin can and remind the universe why it shouldn't mess with us." Rick leaned back in his chair, watching as the others dove back into their tasks. "Aren't you a motivational speaker waiting to happen?" he quipped, earning a chuckle from Thaura. "I'd like to think I'm a realist," she replied, her tone light but her eyes serious. "We might be held together by duct tape and a prayer, but damn if we aren't going to make it work." The work continued, the crew moving with the kind of coordination that only came from shared hardship and mutual stubbornness. They joked and teased, their camaraderie a testament not to the absence of fear, but to the triumph over it. As the hours wore on, Thaura found herself reflecting on everything they'd faced, the adversity that had threatened to tear them apart instead forging them into something stronger, more resilient. In the vast, indifferent expanse of space, it was their humanity, their flaws, their quirks, their relentless refusal to back down, that had seen them through. "Hey, Thaura," Terry called over, her voice cutting through the rhythmic clanking of repairs. "Next time we decide to play God, can we at least get t-shirts? I'd rather have hazard pay," Zek chimed in, grinning as he tightened a bolt with more enthusiasm than was strictly necessary. "Or a vacation," Rick added, his voice a mixture of weariness and amusement. "I hear there's a lovely little asteroid belt not too far from here." "Perfect for a getaway. Keep dreaming," Thaura said, her tone playful but edged with warmth. "For now, let's focus on not getting blown up. Then we can talk about beaches and cocktails." As the final repairs wrapped up, Thaura found herself standing in the middle of the command center, watching her crew with a mixture of pride and gratitude. They'd done the impossible, stared down the void, and come out the other side. And though they might not be heroes, or even particularly sane, it didn't matter. In the end, they were human, gloriously, defiantly human. So when the next crisis inevitably came knocking, as it always did, they'd face it the same way they always had. With determination, with humor, and with the kind of unbreakable spirit that could light up the darkest corners of space. "All right, let's finish this up," Thaura called out, her voice carrying the weight of both exhaustion and resolve. "We've got a universe to conquer, and I'm not getting any younger, or any prettier," Rick quipped, earning a feigned glare and a hidden smirk. The crew laughed, their voices a beacon of life and hope against the cold, indifferent backdrop of the stars. They were battered, bruised, and occasionally borderline insufferable, but they were alive. And that was more than enough. The aftermath of their cosmic calamity felt like waking up after a long night of questionable decisions and even more questionable beverages. The good news was no one was dead or drooling in a corner, muttering about the universe's secrets. The bad news was, well, everything else. Thaura Garin leaned back in her chair, the command console now mercifully quiet, and let out a long breath. She eyed the command center, now a hive of semi-controlled chaos, as her crew tried to shake off the cobwebs of their recent mind meld. "Remind me, Rick," she said. "What did we do to deserve this?" "Was it something I said?" Rick chuckled, still tapping away at his console with a casualness that made it seem like this sort of disaster was an everyday occurrence. "Nah, Commander, must be your winning personality. Or maybe the universe just hates us. Personally, I think it's your taste in music," Terry added, emerging from beneath a mass of cables, her face smeared with grease. "That crap could wake the dead and piss them off," Thaura smirked, shaking her head. "And here I thought Fleet Command would commend my eclectic playlist." Zek, still fidgeting with circuits like a man unwilling to let go of his favorite puzzle, snorted. "Eclectic. That's one way to describe it. I'm just glad there's no lingering psychic residue." "Listening to your thoughts was like being trapped in a nightmare carnival." "Nightmare carnival is exactly what I strive for," Thaura shot back, unable to keep the amusement from her voice. "It keeps life interesting." "Interesting isn't quite the word I'd use." Dr. Mickle Reeve chimed in, appearing at the entrance with the same manic energy he'd worn like a second skin since they'd started this whole fiasco. His lab coat looked as though it had fought with a blender and lost, but survive we did. "Congratulations to us for not becoming brain-fried vegetables." The crew exchanged looks, half smiles, and shared nods acknowledging the unspoken truth. Survival wasn't just about living another day. It was about making sure you still had a sense of humor about it. "Reeve," Thaura called, "did you manage to keep any of your brain cells intact to figure out what went wrong? Who needs brain cells when you have charisma?" Reeve grinned, then shrugged. "But yeah, turns out our cosmic communion was thanks to a glitchy neural interface. Damn thing thought it was smarter than us. We showed it." "Barely," Zek muttered, eyes still glued to his work, but there was a touch of pride in his voice. "Speaking of showing off," Thaura continued, "Fleet Command sent a message. Something about commendations and not firing us into the nearest sun. Apparently they're grateful we kept our heads on, literally and figuratively." Rick leaned back, hands behind his head. "Guess they haven't seen the state of the station yet." Thaura rolled her eyes. "Details, Rick. Never let the truth ruin a good story." Zek looked up, brow furrowed. So we're heroes now. Did they mention hazard pay? Didn't see that part in the memo, Thalra replied dryly. But we do get a shiny piece of paper that says we're not totally incompetent. That's something, right? Rick snorted. Just what I needed. A commendation to hang on my wall. Right next to my collection of caution, wet floor signs. You joke, but this might actually earn us some respect, Terry said, straightening. Even from our alien friends. Friends is a strong word, Thalra retorted, thinking of the various extraterrestrial races they rubbed elbows with, or tried not to. But maybe they'll stop eyeing us like we're about to colonize them. Reeve crossed his arms, a glint in his eyes. You know, humans aren't as unreliable as they think. We did just solve a problem even they couldn't wrap their tentacles around. True, there might be a smidgen more respect now, Thalra admitted. Or at least fewer assassination attempts at diplomatic dinners. The crew laughed, a sound that felt more human than anything the station's AI could synthesize. It was the kind of laughter that said they were ready to face whatever came next, even if what came next was just another day of the same old space madness. So, now what? Zek asked, wiping his hands on his jumpsuit. Do we just go back to pretending everything's normal? Normal's overrated, Rick said with a shrug. And impossible, but we keep on. There's always another wiring mess to sort out, and another cosmic horror to avoid, Terry added cheerfully. All in a day's work, Thalra said, standing up and stretching. But don't worry, we'll get a bit more time to breathe between crises. Unless Reeves got another bright idea. Hey, my ideas are the reason we're all still here, Reeves shot back, mock offended. The reason we're here in the first place too, probably, Thalra quipped. Reeve placed a hand over his heart, feigning hurt. You wound me, Commander. Just keeping you humble, she replied, giving him a grin. Wouldn't want you getting too big for your lab coat. With the crisis averted and the station settling into a semblance of routine, the crew's mood lightened. They moved with renewed purpose, tackling the aftermath like a band of misfits who'd finally found their groove. In the following days, as repairs continued and systems stabilized, Thalra found herself reflecting on their ordeal. The isolation of space often threatened to drive people apart, but somehow, against all odds, the shared madness of Vortex Relay 7 had brought them closer. Hey, Thalra, Terry's voice broke her reverie. She glanced up to see the engineer leaning against the console, a smug grin on her face. Got a bit of news that might interest you. Does it involve less work and more sleep? Thalra asked, feigning hope. Better, Terry replied, her grin widening. Fleet Command wants to send some ambassadors to see our little miracle in action. Apparently they're curious about the resourcefulness of human adaptability. Translation. They want to see if we're still alive and not drooling, Thalra guessed. Pretty much, Terry agreed. But it's a start. Maybe we can impress them with our charm, or our ability to not explode things, Zek offered as he joined them. Either way, Thalra said, feeling a surge of determination, we'll show them just what a bunch of stubborn humans can do. As the crew prepared for their visitors, the station buzzed with an energy that felt different from the usual chaos. It was a mix of excitement and anxiety, a cocktail of emotions that reminded them they were, after all, only human. The day the ambassadors arrived was a spectacle of its own. Thalra watched from the command center as the delegation docked, a mix of aliens with various appendages and expressions that ranged from curiosity to mild disdain. Remember, Thalra told her crew, we smile, we nod, and we don't mention the time we nearly merged our minds into a cosmic smoothie. Got it, Rick said, straightening his uniform. Professionalism at its finest. The introductions were as stiff and formal as one might expect from interstellar diplomacy. Words were exchanged, hands, or equivalent appendages, were shaken, and Thalra did her best to appear like a competent leader rather than someone who'd just recently salvaged her crew's sanity from the brink. After the formalities, she found herself standing with one of the ambassadors, a tall, lanky creature with skin that shimmered like an oil slick. It regarded her with a mixture of skepticism and something that might have been respect. "Commander Garin," it said in a voice that resonated like a slow drumbeat, "your crew has demonstrated a remarkable resilience. We did not think humans capable of such coordination." Thaura smiled, the kind of smile that spoke of hard-won victories and stubborn determination. "We're full of surprises," she replied. "And we're not as fragile as we look. There is strength in unity," the ambassador acknowledged, its eyes, four of them, focusing on her intently. "Perhaps there is more to learn from your kind. Just don't expect us to follow the rules," Thaura said, her tone light but firm. "We have a habit of making our own." The ambassador's expression shifted, and Thaura could have sworn it was something akin to a smile. "Perhaps that is why you succeeded where others might have failed." After the ambassadors departed, leaving behind a slew of diplomatic niceties and promises of future cooperation, the station felt a little less isolated. The crew gathered in the command center, a mix of exhaustion and pride in their eyes. "Well," Thaura said, looking around at her crew, "looks like we've got a few new friends in high places. Or at least friends who won't shoot us on sight." "Progress," Zek said with a grin. "More like a miracle," Terry corrected, though her expression was warm. Rick stretched, cracking his knuckles. "I don't know about you all, but I could use a drink. Or 10. "Sounds like a plan," Thaura agreed, feeling the weight of the last few weeks lifting, if only slightly. "We've earned it." As they made their way to the makeshift lounge, the crew's laughter echoed through the station's corridors, a reminder that even in the darkest reaches of space, they were far from alone. In the end, it wasn't the commendations or the promises of alliance that mattered most. It was the knowledge that they'd faced the void together and not just survived, but thrived. They were, as always, gloriously, defiantly human. And that, Thaura thought, was more than enough.